The gentle hum of the transport plane's engines had become a lullaby by the time Private First Class Thomas Hartley glimpsed the emerald coastline of New Guinea through the small window. It was March 1943, and the morning sun painted the coral sea in shades of turquoise and jade, colors he'd only seen before in the painted backdrops of Hollywood films. Thomas adjusted his glasses, the same wire-rimmed spectacles that had served him well in the projection booths of Camp Roberts back in California, and watched as the jungle-covered mountains rose from the mist like sleeping giants. Thomas wasn't a combat soldier, not in the traditional sense. His weapon was a Bell & Howell 16mm projector, his ammunition the reels of film that brought moments of home to men stationed at the edge of the world. The Army had discovered his experience managing the Rialto Theater in his hometown of Burlington, Iowa, and suddenly, at 23, he found himself designated as a military film projectionist, tasked with maintaining morale through the magic of moving pictures. The plane descended slowly, banking over Port Moresby, where the Australian and American forces had established their primary base. Below, Thomas could see the sprawling military installation carved from the jungle, a patchwork of Quonset huts, supply depots, and makeshift runways. But his destination lay further inland, at a place the map simply marked as Camp Hollow Mountain, a mining operation that supported the Allied war effort in ways most people back home would never know. As the transport touched down on the rough airstrip, the tropical heat embraced him like a warm, damp blanket. The air smelled of earth and vegetation, tinged with aviation fuel and the ever-present hint of rain that seemed to hang in the atmosphere. Thomas gathered his duffel bag in the precious metal cases containing his projection equipment, each piece carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect against the notorious New Guinea humidity. A weathered sergeant with sun-bleached hair and deeply tanned arms met him at the edge of the tarmac. "Private Hartley?" "I'm Sergeant Mike Coleman. I run the transport detail to Hollow Mountain. You're the picture show fellow, right?" Thomas nodded, squinting in the brilliant sunlight. "Yes, Sergeant. Motion Picture Service, attached to Special Services Division." Coleman's face cracked into a grin. "The boys are going to be mighty glad to see you. Haven't had a proper movie night in 3 months. Come on, we've got a 2-hour ride ahead of us, and I want to make it before the afternoon rains hit." The journey to Camp Hollow Mountain took them along a narrow road that had been carved from the jungle by Army engineers. The truck bounced and swayed over roots and rocks, while massive trees formed a green tunnel overhead. Occasionally, they passed groups of native Papuan workers, their dark skin glistening with perspiration as they repaired sections of road washed out by the frequent downpours. These men, Thomas would learn, were invaluable allies, their knowledge of the land and its secrets proving essential to the Allied operations. Coleman drove with practiced ease, one hand on the wheel, the other gesturing as he talked. "Hollow Mountain isn't like other camps," he explained, his voice rising over the engine noise. "We're mining bauxite here, that's aluminum ore, in case you didn't know. Stuff's vital for airplane production. The Japs would love to get their hands on this operation, but the mountain's natural defenses and our boys keep them at bay." The road began to climb, winding through increasingly dense forest. Birds with brilliant plumage flashed between the trees, their calls creating a symphony that was both beautiful and alien. The air grew slightly cooler as they gained altitude, though the humidity remained oppressive. "The mining operation runs 24 hours, Coleman continued. "We've got about 300 men working the site, Americans, Australians, and local labor. The conditions are tough, but the ore we're pulling out of that mountain is helping build the planes that'll win this war." As they rounded a final bend, Camp Hollow Mountain came into view. It was unlike any military installation Thomas had seen. Built into the side of a mountain, the camp seemed to grow organically from the jungle itself. Wooden structures on stilts perched on the slopes, connected by raised walkways that kept men above the muddy ground during the frequent rains. At the center of it all was the mine entrance, a dark mouth in the mountain face, from which narrow-gauge rail tracks emerged like a tongue. The constant sound of machinery filled the air, the rhythmic pounding of pneumatic drills, the clatter of ore cars on rails, the steady thrum of generators providing power to the operation. It was industrial music, a mechanical symphony that never ceased. Thomas's quarters were in a long building that housed the camp's recreational facilities. His room was simple, a cot with mosquito netting, a small desk, a footlocker, and precious little else. But the adjacent space had been designated as the camp's theater, and it was here that Thomas would work his particular brand of magic. The theater was really just a large tent with a raised wooden floor, but someone had gone to considerable effort to make it special. Rows of benches faced a painted white wall that would serve as the screen. A small projection booth had been constructed at the back, elevated to provide the proper angle for projection. It was humble, but Thomas had worked with less. As he unpacked his equipment, carefully checking each component for damage from the journey, a steady stream of miners began to appear at the tent entrance. They were a sight to behold, men covered in pale gray dust from the bauxite, their faces showing the exhaustion of hard labor in difficult conditions. But their eyes lit up when they saw Thomas preparing the projector. "Are you really the movie man?" asked the young private, his Australian accent thick as honey. His uniform was stained with sweat and dust, and his hands bore the calluses of a picker. "I am," Thomas replied, threading a test reel through the projector's gates. "Shows start tomorrow night, and every night after that, weather permitting." Word spread through the camp like wildfire. By evening, Thomas had met dozens of miners, each eager to share their story and even more eager to hear what films he'd brought. As the tropical sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Thomas realized he'd found his own front line, not one of bullets and battles, but of morale and memories. Thomas's first full day at Camp Hollow Mountain began before dawn, awakened by the shift change whistle that pierced the pre-dawn darkness. Through his mosquito netting, he could hear the sounds of men preparing for another day's labor, the splash of water from wash basins, the murmur of tired conversation, the clink of mess kits being gathered for breakfast. He dressed quickly in his khakis, already learning that the morning hours offered the coolest temperatures of the day. Making his way to the mess tent, he observed the miners more closely. They moved with a particular gait, slightly stooped, their bodies shaped by hours spent in the low tunnels of the mountain. Their hands were remarkable, thick with muscle, stained permanently gray from the bauxite dust that no amount of washing could completely remove. At breakfast, Thomas sat with a group of American miners from the night shift. They ate heartily, powdered eggs, canned bacon, and thick slices of bread that had been baked in the camp's field ovens. Coffee flowed freely, strong and bitter, the fuel that kept the operation running. "You want to understand what we do here," said Corporal Jim Watson, a former coal miner from Pennsylvania, "you need to see the inside of that mountain. His face was prematurely aged, lines etched deep by dust and exhaustion, but his eyes held a fierce pride. After breakfast, equipped with a helmet and lamp borrowed from the supply sergeant, Thomas followed Watson to the mine entrance. The temperature dropped noticeably as they entered, the oppressive jungle heat replaced by the mountain's cool embrace. The entrance tunnel was reinforced with massive timber beams, each one carefully selected from the surrounding forest and treated to resist the constant moisture. The main tunnel extended into darkness, lit at intervals by electric bulbs strung along the ceiling. The floor was uneven, worn smooth in places by countless boots, rough and broken in others where the rock resisted easy passage. Water seeped from the walls in places, creating small rivulets that ran along channels carved specifically to direct the flow away from the work areas. "Bauxite's not like coal," Watson explained as they walked deeper into the mountain. "It's softer, easier to extract in some ways, but the dust is something else. Gets into everything, your lungs, your eyes, your equipment. That's why we work in shorter shifts than we might otherwise." They passed through several chambers where the mining actively took place. The sound was overwhelming, pneumatic drills biting into rock, the crash of ore being loaded into cars, the shouts of men coordinating their efforts above the din. The drill operators worked in teams of two, one man operating the drill, another managing the air hose and clearing debris. The drills themselves were Gardner Denver pneumatic models, their rapid-fire percussion creating clouds of dust despite the water spray used to suppress it. Thomas watched, fascinated, as a drill team worked on a promising vein. The operator, a stocky Australian sergeant named Bruce Mackenzie, handled the 90-pound drill with practiced ease, though Thomas could see the strain in his shoulders and arms. The drill bit into the bauxite with a sound like controlled thunder, sending vibrations through the rock that Thomas could feel in his boots. "For hours on the drill is about all a man can take," Mackenzie explained during a break, wiping sweat and dust from his face with a rag that only seemed to smear it around. "Your whole body becomes a shock absorber. By the end of a shift, you can still feel the vibration in your bones, even when you're lying in your bunk." The extracted ore was loaded by hand into small rail cars, each one capable of holding about a ton of material. The loading was back-breaking work, men with shovels and picks breaking up larger chunks, filling the cars one shovelful at a time. Thomas noticed how they moved in rhythm, almost like a dance, each man timing his movements to avoid interfering with the others in the confined space. The loaded cars were pushed by hand along the narrow-gauge tracks to the main tunnel, where they connected to a cable system that hauled them to the surface. The trip out was slightly downhill, making it easier, but Thomas could only imagine the effort required when the system was first being established and every car had to be muscled entirely by human power. At the surface, the ore went through a basic processing setup. It was crushed using a jaw crusher, a massive machine that could reduce basketball-sized chunks to gravel in seconds. The crushed ore was then screened to remove the finest particles and loaded into trucks for transport to the coast, where it would be shipped to Australia and eventually to the aluminum smelters that fed the aircraft factories. The skill required for this work went far beyond simple manual labor. The miners had to read the rock, understanding where the bauxite veins ran and how to extract them efficiently. They needed to recognize when a section of tunnel required additional support, when water seepage indicated potential instability, when the color and texture of the rock suggested a particularly rich deposit. "It's like the mountain talks to you," explained Private Tony Bernardino, a former construction worker from New York. You learn to listen to the way the drill sounds change when you hit different types of rock. You can feel through the drill when you're getting close to a void or a water pocket. It's all in the hands and the ears. The physical toll was evident everywhere Thomas looked. Men moved slowly when not actively working, conserving energy for the demands of their shifts. Their bodies were lean, stripped of any excess weight by the combination of hard labor and basic rations. Cuts and bruises were common, treated casually unless they threatened to become infected in the tropical environment. Safety equipment was basic by later standards. Helmets were metal, designed more to protect against falling rocks than to absorb impact. Lamps were carbide models that required careful maintenance to prevent dangerous gas buildup. Some men wore bandanas over their faces to filter the worst of the dust, but proper respirators were rare and reserved for the most dust-intensive operations. The mountain had its own dangers beyond the obvious ones of cave-ins and equipment accidents. The heat and humidity created perfect conditions for fungal infections. Small cuts could become serious wounds if not properly treated. The constant moisture led to persistent skin conditions that plagued many of the miners. And always, there was the dust, the fine bauxite particles that coated everything and everyone, working its way into lungs and causing a persistent cough that echoed through the camp at night. Despite these hardships, Thomas sensed a deep pride among the miners. They knew their work was vital to the war effort. Every ton of bauxite they extracted would become aluminum for aircraft parts, perhaps a section of fuselage for AB-17, or propeller blades for AP-38 Lightning. They might not be facing enemy fire directly, but they were fighting the war with picks and shovels, one rail car at a time. As the sun began its descent behind the western mountains, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples, Thomas prepared for his first show at Camp Hollow Mountain. He had spent the afternoon cleaning the projector's lens, checking the film gates, and testing the sound system, a pair of speakers that, while not providing the finest audio quality, would suffice for the outdoor setting. The film for tonight was The Philadelphia Story, starring Cary Grant, Katharine Hepburn, and James Stewart. Thomas had chosen it carefully from his collection, knowing that after a day in the mines, the men would appreciate the sophisticated comedy and the glimpse of a world far removed from their current reality. Word had spread throughout the camp, and by 1900 hours, miners began filtering into the makeshift theater. They came fresh from the showers, their hair still damp, wearing their cleanest uniforms. Some brought letters from home to read by the projector's light before the show began. Others carried precious treats hoarded from care packages, chocolate bars, cigarettes, or chewing gum, to enjoy during the film. Thomas watched them file in, noting how different they looked from the dust-covered men he'd observed in the mountain. Clean-shaven and relaxed, they seemed younger, more like the boys many of them were 18, 19, 20-year-olds who should have been in college or starting careers, not extracting ore from a mountain half a world away from home. Sergeant Coleman had arranged the seating by shift schedules, ensuring that men from all three shifts would have opportunities to attend shows throughout the week. The night shift workers, who would report to the mountain at midnight, sat in the front rows, wanting to maximize their entertainment before returning to labor. As twilight deepened and the jungle sounds shifted from day creatures to night, the buzz of insects, the distant call of night birds, the rustle of nocturnal animals in the underbrush, Thomas started the projector. The familiar mechanical whir filled the tent, and a beam of light cut through the darkness to illuminate the screen. The men fell silent as the MGM lion roared, its sound echoing off the mountain face. For the next 2 hours, they were transported to Philadelphia society, to a world of witty dialogue, elegant clothes, and romantic complications that seemed charmingly simple compared to their current situation. Thomas operated the projector with practiced ease, changing reels seamlessly, adjusting focus as needed, monitoring the sound levels. But he also watched the audience, saw how they leaned forward during certain scenes, heard their laughter at Stewart's drunken monologue, noticed the wistful expressions during the romantic moments. During the reel change, while the screen was dark, he heard snippets of conversation. "Haven't seen a woman in evening dress in so long, I'd forgotten they existed. That house they live in, imagine having that much space just for one family. Stewart reminds me of my brother. Same kind of awkward charm." These men, who spent their days in darkness extracting ore from the earth, were hungry for light and life and connection to the world they'd left behind. The films were more than entertainment, they were lifelines to civilization, reminders of what they were fighting to preserve. Over the following weeks, Thomas established a routine that intertwined with the rhythm of the mining operation. He would spend his mornings maintaining his equipment and organizing film reels, his afternoons learning about the mining operation and recording the stories of the men who worked it, and his evenings providing the entertainment that had become the highlight of many miners' days. One afternoon, while cleaning his projector lens with the careful attention of a watchmaker, he was visited by Captain Robert Harrison, the officer in charge of the mining operation. Harrison was a geological engineer from the Colorado School of Mines, a thoughtful man in his 30s who managed to maintain an air of academic curiosity despite the harsh conditions. "Private Hartley," Harrison began, settling onto a wooden crate that served as a chair, "I wanted to talk to you about what we're really doing here. The men know they're mining bauxite for aluminum, but I'm not sure they fully grasp the significance of this operation." Harrison produced a small sample of bauxite from his pocket, its reddish-brown surface dull in the filtered sunlight. "This ore, it's about 40 to 60% aluminum oxide. Back in the States, in the smelters, they use an electrolytic process to extract pure aluminum. It takes enormous amounts of electricity, about 7 kilowatt-hours per pound of aluminum produced." He turned the ore sample in his fingers, studying it with the eye of someone who understood its hidden value. A single B-24 Liberator bomber requires about 18,000 pounds of aluminum. That's roughly 30 tons of bauxite ore. Our operation here produces about 200 tons a day when we're running at full capacity. So every 3 days, we're mining enough ore for 20 bombers. The mathematics of war, Thomas realized, were calculated in tonnage and sweat, in the accumulated effort of hundreds of men working in difficult conditions. Each swing of a pick, each rail car of ore, each truck navigating the dangerous road to the coast, it all added up to aircraft that would carry the fight to the enemy. "The Japanese know we're here," Harrison continued. "We've had reconnaissance planes fly over several times. But the mountain provides natural protection, and the jungle makes a ground assault nearly impossible. Still, we can't relax our vigilance. The ore we're extracting is too valuable." That evening, Thomas showed Sergeant York, the Gary Cooper film about the World War I hero. The parallels weren't lost on the audience, men doing their duty in difficult circumstances, far from home, part of a larger effort they might not fully understand but were committed to nonetheless. After the show, a group of Australian miners invited Thomas to join them for what they called supper, really just tea and biscuits, but a cherished ritual that reminded them of home. They sat outside, under a canopy of stars brilliant in the clear mountain air, and shared their stories. There was Corporal David Blue Chapman, nicknamed for the distinctive blue eyes that seemed even more striking against his dust-darkened skin. He'd been a gold miner in Western Australia before the war, working claims in the desert where water was more precious than the metal they sought. "Mining's in my blood," Blue explained, his voice carrying the musical cadence of the outback. "My grandfather came out during the gold rush of the 1890s. Died in a cave-in when my father was just a boy. Dad swore he'd never go underground, became a sheep farmer instead. But here I am, continuing the family tradition in a way." Blue's hands, as he gestured, told their own story. The fingernails were permanently discolored, the knuckles enlarged from years of gripping tools, small scars crisscrossing the skin like a map of past injuries. Yet he handled his teacup with surprising delicacy, a reminder that miners required finesse as well as strength. Private William Billy Foster, barely 19, had been a bank clerk in Sydney before enlisting. The transition from handling money to handling ore had been jarring, but he'd adapted with the resilience of youth. "Never thought I'd be grateful for all those hours of rugby practice," Billy said with a grin. "The physical conditioning helped, but more than that, it taught me about working as a team. In the mines, you have to trust the bloke next to you completely. One man's mistake can hurt everyone." He described the unspoken communication that developed between mining partners, a glance that meant unstable ceiling, a hand gesture indicating move the lamp left, a whistle pattern that signaled all clear or danger. It was a language born of necessity, refined by repetition, and understood perfectly by those who spoke it. Sergeant Jack Morrison, the senior Australian NCO, had perhaps the most unusual background. He'd been a theatre set designer in Melbourne, creating elaborate backdrops for productions ranging from Shakespeare to modern dramas. His artist's eyes saw beauty even in the harsh environment of the mine. "The way the lamplight plays on the bauxite veins, it's like abstract art," he said. "Reds and browns and sometimes these brilliant orange streaks where the iron content is high. If I had my paints, I could show you. After the war, maybe I will. People should know it wasn't all darkness down there." Morrison had sketched throughout his time at Hollow Mountain, using charcoal sticks he made himself from burned wood and paper from wherever he could find it. His drawings captured moments of daily life, men sharing a smoke break in a safe chamber, the precise angle of a drill operator's stance, the way exhausted miners looked sleeping on the transport trucks, their bodies unconsciously swaying with the vehicle's movement. October brought the beginning of the monsoon season to New Guinea, and with it, a new set of challenges for the mining operation. The rains came with a violence that Thomas, raised in the relatively gentle climate of Iowa, found both terrifying and mesmerizing. They would build throughout the day, clouds massing over the mountains like an invading army, then release their burden in torrential downpours that turned the camp into a muddy lake. The mine entrances had been engineered with drainage in mind, but the sheer volume of water tested every system. Pumps ran continuously, their diesel engines adding another layer to the constant noise of the camp. Water seeped through cracks in the mountain, creating new streams where none had existed before, requiring constant vigilance to prevent flooding of the work areas. Thomas learned to protect his equipment with an almost obsessive care. Each film reel was wrapped in multiple layers of oilcloth and stored in ammunition boxes that had been repurposed as waterproof containers. The projector, when not in use, was shrouded in canvas and surrounded by containers of silica gel to absorb moisture. Despite these precautions, the humidity was relentless, and he spent hours each day cleaning and maintaining his equipment to prevent the growth of mold that could destroy film in days. The rains transformed the mining work as well. The ore, when wet, became a heavy, clay-like substance that clung to everything. Loading the rail cars became even more arduous as the wet bauxite would stick to shovels and require constant scraping. The rail tracks needed continuous clearing as mud washed down from the slopes above. In the tunnels, the increased water created new hazards. Ceiling supports that had been solid became questionable as the water softened the earth around them. The floor turned treacherous, slippery with mud that could cause a man carrying heavy equipment to lose his footing. The accident rate increased, though fortunately most injuries remained minor: twisted ankles, bruised ribs, cuts from falling against rough stone. One evening, the rain was so intense that Thomas had to cancel the film showing. Instead, he found himself in the mess tent with a group of miners, listening to their stories while the rain drummed on the canvas roof with such force that they had to shout to be heard. Corporal Sam Rodriguez, a former hard rock miner from Arizona, described the worst accident he'd witnessed. 3 weeks before you arrived, we had a partial collapse in Tunnel 3. Nobody was killed, thank God, but 2 men were trapped for 6 hours while we dug them out. The water was rising the whole time. We worked like madmen, passing buckets of debris hand to hand while the engineers reinforced the ceiling above us. The trapped men, Rodriguez explained, had remained remarkably calm, singing songs to keep their spirits up while their colleagues worked to free them. When finally extracted, wet and exhausted but unharmed, they had insisted on returning to work the next day, not wanting to let their team down. These stories of camaraderie and determination were common. The harsh conditions had forged bonds between men that transcended nationality, background, and rank. Americans and Australians worked side by side, sharing techniques and stories. The Papuan workers, initially viewed with suspicion by some, had proven invaluable with their knowledge of local conditions and their incredible endurance in the tropical climate. Thomas learned about the informal economy that had developed within the camp. Cigarettes were currency, with elaborate exchange rates for various goods and services. A carton of Lucky Strikes could buy a man a handmade knife from one of the Papuan workers. 3 packs of Camels would get your laundry done for a week. A single cigarette could purchase a place closer to the front at movie night. There was also a thriving trade in souvenirs. Miners would polish particularly attractive pieces of bauxite ore, creating paperweights that they hoped to take home after the war. Others collected Japanese equipment from downed aircraft or abandoned positions: helmets, canteens, pieces of aluminum from Zero fighters that had crashed in the jungle. These items were technically contraband, but officers generally turned a blind eye, understanding that the men needed something tangible to mark their service in this remote place. November brought an intensification of the mining operation. Intelligence reports suggested that the Japanese were planning a major offensive, and every ton of bauxite became even more critical for the production of aircraft needed to maintain air superiority. The order came down: increase production by 30%. To meet this demand, shifts were extended from 8 to 10 hours, and the 6-day work week became 7. Thomas watched as the already exhausted men pushed themselves even harder, their determination mixed with a grim understanding of necessity. The human cost of this increased production became evident quickly. The camp medical tent, run by Captain James Mitchell, a doctor from Boston, saw a steady stream of men suffering from exhaustion, dehydration, and the cumulative effects of prolonged exposure to bauxite dust. Mitchell, a thoughtful man who had given up a lucrative practice to serve, spoke to Thomas one evening about his concerns. The human body isn't designed for this level of sustained effort in these conditions, Mitchell explained, his voice heavy with frustration. I'm seeing respiratory problems that will likely plague these men for years. The dust creates a form of pneumoconiosis, similar to what coal miners develop, but with its own characteristics. The aluminum oxide particles embed in the lung tissue, creating inflammation and reducing lung capacity. He showed Thomas X-rays taken with the camp's portable unit, ghostly images where healthy lung tissue should appear clear but instead showed cloudy areas of damage. I can treat the symptoms, provide expectorants, recommend rest that I know they won't get, but I can't undo the damage being done. Despite the medical concerns, the miners continued their relentless pace. Thomas began showing films twice each evening to accommodate the extended shifts, often running the projector until well past midnight. He noticed that comedies were increasingly requested, Laurel and Hardy, the Marx Brothers, anything that could provide laughter as a temporary escape from exhaustion. One night, after showing Duck Soup, Thomas was approached by Private Eugene Walsh, a young miner from Ohio who had been particularly affected by the extended hours. Walsh's hands shook slightly from fatigue, and his persistent cough interrupted his words. Mr. Hartley, Walsh began, using the civilian title that some of the men preferred, I wanted to thank you for what you're doing here. These pictures, they're the only thing that makes this bearable sometimes. For 2 hours, I can forget about the mountain, forget about the dust, forget about everything except what's on that screen. Walsh pulled out a worn photograph of a young woman, pretty in a wholesome way, standing in front of a white farmhouse. That's Mary, my fiancée. When I watch those romance pictures, I imagine it's us up there, having adventures, living that life. It keeps me going, knowing that when this is over, we'll have our own story. Thomas learned that many of the men created elaborate fantasies around the films, inserting themselves and their loved ones into the narratives. It was a form of psychological escape that helped maintain sanity in an insane situation. The Papuan workers, who had initially been excluded from the film showings, were eventually invited to attend. Though most didn't understand English, they were mesmerized by the moving images. Thomas noticed how they particularly enjoyed the musical numbers, responding to the universal language of rhythm and melody. One evening, after showing Top Hat with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, he witnessed several Papuan workers attempting to recreate the dance steps, their natural grace making up for their unfamiliarity with ballroom technique. December arrived with no decrease in the rain but a noticeable increase in homesickness among the men. Christmas decorations began appearing throughout the camp, makeshift trees constructed from local ferns, ornaments carved from soft stone or fashioned from tin cans, stars cut from aluminum salvaged from crashed aircraft. Thomas had saved something special for the season, It's a Wonderful Life, though it was a recent film that had only just reached the Pacific Theater. He also had several short subjects, cartoons, newsreels, and most precious of all, a collection of Christmas messages from celebrities that had been produced specifically for troops overseas. The camp commander, Colonel William Davidson, a career officer from West Point, had arranged for a Christmas ceasework order. For one day, December 25th, the mine would be silent. It was a calculated risk, production would suffer, but morale needed the boost. On Christmas Eve, Thomas set up his projector for what would be the most attended show of his tenure at Hollow Mountain. Every man not on essential duty crowded into the theater tent, with others standing outside, able to hear if not see. He began with the cartoons, Donald Duck, Mickey Mouse, Bugs Bunny, their antics drawing laughter that seemed to release months of tension. Then came the Christmas messages. Bob Hope appeared on screen, his familiar smirk in place as he delivered jokes about army food and tropical weather. Bing Crosby sang White Christmas, his smooth baritone causing more than a few men to wipe their eyes. Betty Grable, in a sequin dress that sparkled even in black and white, sent her love to all the brave men serving far from home. But it was the final message that created the most impact. President Roosevelt himself appeared, his familiar voice filling the tent. To the men serving in places whose names their families cannot pronounce, doing work that cannot be described in letters home, know that your nation is grateful. Whether you carry a rifle or a shovel, whether you face the enemy directly or support those who do, you are all soldiers in the cause of freedom. Your sacrifice today ensures a better tomorrow for generations yet unborn. The tent was silent for a long moment after the president's image faded from the screen. Then, spontaneously, someone began singing the Star-Spangled Banner. Others joined in, Australians switching to God Save the King for the second verse, creating a harmonic blend of Allied patriotism that echoed off the mountain. The feature film, It's a Wonderful Life, seemed particularly poignant in this setting. George Bailey's frustrations with being stuck in Bedford Falls resonated with men stuck in a jungle mine. His realization of his life's value, of how his seemingly small contributions mattered, paralleled their own situation. They might not be storming beaches or shooting down enemy planes, but their work mattered. After the show, impromptu Christmas parties broke out throughout the camp. Care packages that had been hoarded for months were opened and shared. Someone had managed to ferment a batch of jungle juice from local fruits, and while it tasted terrible, it provided the mild alcoholic buzz that made voices louder and laughter easier. Thomas found himself pulled into a gathering of miners who insisted he join their improvised carol singing. They sang every Christmas song they could remember, filling in forgotten lyrics with humming or improvisation. Silent Night became particularly moving when sung by men who hadn't known a truly silent night in months, the constant noise of the jungle and the mine their continuous companion. Private Tony Bernardino had somehow acquired a guitar and played while others sang. His fingers, thick from mine work, struggled with some of the more delicate chord changes, but the music he produced was beautiful in its imperfection. Between songs, men shared Christmas memories from home, family traditions, favorite foods, gifts given and received in better times. Sergeant Coleman told of Christmas in rural Texas, where his family would roast a wild boar his father had hunted. Corporal Chapman described Australian Christmases, celebrated in the heat of summer with beach picnics and cold beer. Private Foster, the young bank clerk turned miner, spoke wistfully of his mother's plum pudding, describing in loving detail the months-long process of its creation. As midnight approached and Christmas Day officially began, a strange sound cut through the celebrations: church bells. Someone had rigged up a series of empty oxygen tanks and was striking them with a hammer, creating a reasonable approximation of church bells. The sound carried through the camp and into the jungle, a declaration of civilization in the wilderness. January 1944 brought a brief respite from the rains and an opportunity for the miners to make up for lost production. The mine operated at peak efficiency, with teams rotating through the tunnels in a carefully choreographed dance of extraction. Thomas had become so attuned to the rhythm of the operation that he could tell the time of day by the sounds: the morning shift's energetic drilling, the afternoon's steady loading, the night shift's methodical expansion of the tunnels. He had also become the unofficial chronicler of the camp, using a typewriter borrowed from the administrative office to record the stories and experiences of the miners. These weren't official reports but personal narratives that he hoped might someday help people understand what had happened in this remote corner of the war. One of his most fascinating subjects was Master Sergeant Albert Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who had been a mining engineer in the Silesian coal fields before emigrating to America in the 1930s. Kowalski had an almost mystical understanding of rock and stone, reading the mountain's geology like others might read a book. "Every mountain has its own personality," Kowalski explained one afternoon, standing at the mine entrance and gazing at the exposed rock face. "This one, she's old and tired, worn down by millions of years of rain and wind. The bauxite, it formed from volcanic ash, transformed by time and pressure into something valuable. It's alchemy, really, nature turning one thing into another." Kowalski could predict where the richest ore deposits would be found by observing subtle changes in rock color and texture. He taught the younger miners to feel for temperature variations in the stone. Cooler areas often indicated denser, higher quality ore. He showed them how to listen to the mountain's sounds, the subtle creaks and groans that preceded instability. "In the old country," he said, "we had a saying, 'The mountain gives, but the mountain takes.' You must always respect her, never become overconfident. The moment you think you've mastered the mountain, that's when she reminds you who's really in charge." His wisdom had saved lives. 3 times, he had ordered evacuations of tunnel sections minutes before collapses. Each time, he couldn't fully explain how he knew. It was a combination of subtle signs, experience, and intuition honed over decades underground. Under Kowalski's guidance, the mining operation had developed its own innovations. They had created a cooling system using water from an underground stream, channeling it through pipes to create primitive air conditioning in the deepest tunnels. They had developed a rail car braking system using local hardwoods that proved more reliable than the metal brakes that quickly corroded in the humidity. Most impressively, they had established a partnership with the local Papuan tribes that went beyond simple employment. The natives had shown them which local plants could be used to treat minor injuries and infections, knowledge that proved invaluable when medical supplies ran low. In return, the miners had taught basic engineering principles, enabling the Papuans to improve their own village infrastructure. One Papuan elder, a man known simply as Joseph, his real name being unpronounceable to American tongues, had become particularly close to the mining operation. He claimed his grandfather had known of the red rock in the mountain for generations, considering it cursed because it couldn't be used for tools or building. The irony that this useless rock was now so valuable wasn't lost on him. Joseph shared stories of the mountain's history, ancient tribal battles fought on its slopes, legendary warriors who had sought visions in its caves, the belief that the mountain was hollow because it contained the sleeping spirit of an ancient god. These stories, told through a combination of pidgin English and elaborate hand gestures, became part of the camp's folklore. By February 1944, the war had shifted. The successful campaigns in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea had pushed the Japanese forces back, and Camp Hollow Mountain was no longer on the front lines. The pressure for maximum production eased slightly, allowing the men to return to more sustainable working hours. Thomas had been at the camp for nearly a year, and his collection of films had been played and replayed so many times that men could recite dialogue from memory. During Casablanca, the entire audience would join Bogart in saying, "Here's looking at you, kid." During The Wizard of Oz, they sang along with Somewhere Over the Rainbow, their voices mixing with Judy Garland's in a poignant harmony. One evening, after showing Going My Way with Bing Crosby, Thomas was approached by Captain Harrison with news: "The operation here is winding down. We've extracted most of the accessible high-grade ore, and new sources have been developed closer to the coast. The camp will be gradually demobilized over the next 2 months." The news spread quickly, generating mixed reactions. Many men were eager to leave, to move on to new assignments or, hopefully, home. Others had formed such strong bonds with their fellow miners that the thought of separation was painful. The mountain, for all its hardships, had become a strange sort of home. The final weeks took on a bittersweet quality. The mining continued, but at a relaxed pace that allowed for reflection. Men began creating commemorative items, pieces of bauxite carved with unit insignias, group photographs taken with Thomas's camera, detailed maps of the tunnel systems drawn from memory. Thomas organized a special series of showings, allowing the men to vote on their favorite films for repeat viewing. The Best Years of Our Lives proved particularly popular, its story of veterans returning home resonating with men who were beginning to think about their own return to civilian life. During one of these final showings, the projector, faithful through months of constant use in terrible conditions, finally gave out. The main drive gear, worn down by dust and humidity, stripped its teeth with a grinding sound that brought groans from the audience. Thomas worked through the night trying to repair it, but some parts simply couldn't be improvised. The next evening, without a film to show, the men created their own entertainment. It started with Corporal Chapman telling a story about a bar fight in Sydney, embellishing it with each telling until it became an epic saga. Others joined in with their own tales, and soon the theater tent had become a storytelling circle. Private Walsh, the young man from Ohio who had shared his fiancée's picture with Thomas, stood up and recited from memory the entire balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet, having memorized it from repeated viewings of the 1936 film. His performance, delivered with genuine emotion despite his exhaustion, earned a standing ovation. Sergeant Morrison, the theater set designer, had spent weeks working in secret on a project. Using salvaged materials and handmade paints derived from local minerals and plants, he had created a backdrop painting of the camp and the mountain. It was remarkable, capturing not just the physical appearance but the feeling of the place, the oppressive jungle, the dark mine entrance, the small human figures dwarfed by their surroundings but somehow heroic in their insignificance. On the last night before the first group was scheduled to leave, they held a final gathering. Colonel Davidson made a speech, praising the men for their service and sacrifice. He read statistics: total tonnage extracted, estimated number of aircraft produced from there or 0 combat casualties despite being in a war zone, but concluded by saying that numbers couldn't capture what had really been accomplished. "You men have proven that the line between combat and support is meaningless," he said. "You've fought your war with picks and shovels, with drills and determination. The aluminum from this mountain has become the wings that carry our brothers in arms to victory. You should be proud." March 1944 saw the systematic dismantling of Camp Hollow Mountain. The equipment was cleaned, catalogued, and prepared for shipment to other operations. The Papuan workers were paid their final wages, a combination of Australian pounds and trade goods that would make them wealthy by local standards. Thomas spent his final days interviewing as many men as possible, trying to capture their experiences before they scattered to the winds. He typed late into the night, his fingers flying over the keys as he transcribed stories, descriptions, and feelings that might otherwise be lost to history. One of his last interviews was with Master Sergeant Kowalski, who had received orders to report to a new mining operation in the Philippines. They sat at the mine entrance, looking into the darkness that had swallowed so many hours of their lives. "You know what I'll remember most?" Kowalski asked. "Not the hardship or the exhaustion. I'll remember the sound of 30 men singing in the tunnels. When the drilling stopped and we were between shifts, sometimes someone would start a song, and it would echo through the mountain. Harmony born from stone and struggle." He picked up a piece of bauxite, examining it in the fading light. "This rock, it's been here for millions of years. We've been here for 1 year. Yet we've changed each other, the mountain and us. It's given us its treasure, and we've given it our sweat and blood. That's a fair exchange, I think." The Papuan workers held a farewell ceremony, a mixture of traditional customs and adapted Christian elements that reflected the cultural exchange that had occurred. They performed a dance that told the story of the mountain and the men who had entered it, with movements that mimicked drilling, loading, and the exhausted sleep of workers. It was both beautiful and heartbreaking, a primitive art form capturing an industrial experience. Joseph, the elder, presented Thomas with a carved wooden mask, its features stylized but recognizable as a face half human, half mountain. "You bring the dreams," he said in his broken English. "The moving pictures that made men smile. The mountain will remember." As the trucks loaded for the final convoy out, Thomas took one last walk through the camp. The theater tent had already been struck, leaving only a rectangle of flattened earth where so many evenings of escape had taken place. The mine entrance was being sealed with explosives, standard procedure to prevent enemy use, though by now the Japanese threat had largely passed. He thought about all the films he had shown, the faces illuminated by the projector's light, the laughter and tears and silence that had filled the space. Every movie had been a small victory against despair, a reminder that there was a world beyond the jungle and the mine, a world worth fighting to preserve and return to. The convoy departed at dawn, the trucks winding down the mountain road that had brought them all to this place. Thomas looked back once to see the morning sun catching the peak of Hollow Mountain, making it glow like the gold that it didn't contain but had somehow produced, the gold of human endurance, friendship, and shared purpose. The journey from Camp Hollow Mountain to the coast took on the quality of a dream. The familiar landmarks, the river crossing where they'd lost a truck to flooding, the Papuan village where they'd traded cigarettes for fresh fruit, the crashed Japanese bomber that had become a navigation marker, passed by like scenes from a film running in reverse. At Port Moresby, Thomas found himself among hundreds of other support personnel being processed for redeployment or discharge. The bureaucracy of war reasserted itself, forms to be filled, equipment to be returned, medical examinations to ensure they weren't carrying tropical diseases back to civilization. Dr. Mitchell, the camp medical officer, had arranged for chest X-rays of all the miners. The results were sobering. Nearly every man showed some degree of lung damage from the bauxite dust. Mitchell had written detailed medical reports, hoping they would help secure proper treatment and compensation for the men after the war. "These men are casualties just as surely as if they'd been wounded by enemy fire," he told Thomas. "The mountain took its toll, even if the damage isn't immediately visible." While waiting for transport, Thomas encountered other members of the motion picture service. They shared stories of showing films in various unlikely places, on destroyer decks between battles, in underground bunkers on contested islands, in hospitals where the wounded needed distraction from their pain. Each projectionist had become a keeper of morale, a purveyor of dreams in nightmare circumstances. One projectionist, Sergeant Harold Martinez from California, had shown films during the Battle of Guadalcanal, continuing to run his projector even as Japanese shells fell nearby. "The men needed those 2 hours of normalcy," he explained. "When everything around you is chaos, a movie reminds you that order and beauty still exist somewhere." Thomas shared his own stories of Camp Hollow Mountain, of men watching musicals after 12-hour shifts in the mine, of Papuans mesmerized by Fred Astaire, of the night the projector died and the men became their own entertainment. Martinez listened with understanding. He too had seen how cinema could sustain the human spirit in inhuman conditions. The voyage home was aboard a Liberty ship, its cargo holds filled with wounded soldiers and exhausted support personnel. Thomas found many of his fellow miners aboard, all heading back to Australia or the United States for reassignment or discharge. They naturally gravitated toward each other, their shared experience creating an immediate bond. In the evenings, they would gather on deck, smoking cigarettes and watching the sun set over the Pacific. The conversation would inevitably turn to their plans for after the war. Private Walsh wanted to marry as Mary and open a hardware store. Corporal Chapman planned to return to gold mining, but this time as his own boss. Sergeant Morrison dreamed of mounting a theatrical production about their experiences, though he wondered if anyone would believe it. "Who's going to want to hear about blokes digging rocks out of a mountain?" he mused. "No heroic charges, no dogfights, just day after day of hard labor." Yet it mattered, didn't it? Every ton of ore was bullets and bombs and aircraft. We were warriors with shovels instead of rifles. As the ship approached the California coast, Thomas spent his time writing, trying to capture not just the facts of what had happened but the feeling of it. He wrote about the weight of a pneumatic drill after 4 hours of operation, the way bauxite dust turned everything gray, the sound of rain on tent canvas mixing with men's snores. He wrote about the films he'd shown and how they'd been received. How Mrs. Miniver had made tough miners cry. How Chaplin's The Great Dictator had provided cathartic laughter at Hitler's expense. How Green Was My Valley had resonated with men who understood mining families' struggles. Most importantly, he wrote about the men themselves. Not as statistics or military personnel numbers, but as individuals. Jim Watson, the Pennsylvania coal miner who could diagnose mechanical problems by sound alone. Bruce Mackenzie, the Australian who taught everyone his grandmother's recipe for damper bread cooked over an open fire. Tony Bernardino, whose guitar playing had provided the soundtrack to their exile. He wrote about the Papuan workers, too often forgotten in official accounts. Their knowledge of jungle survival had prevented numerous casualties from snake bites and tropical diseases. Their songs, sung while loading trucks, had become part of the camp's acoustic landscape. Their children, who would gather at the edge of camp to watch the films from a distance, their eyes wide with wonder at the moving pictures. Thomas thought about the tons of bauxite they'd extracted, now transformed into aluminum somewhere in a stateside factory. By his calculations, their ore had become enough aluminum for perhaps 2,000 aircraft. Each B-24 Liberator had a crew of 10 men. Each could carry 8,000 pounds of bombs. The mathematics of their contribution was staggering when considered in aggregate. But he also thought about the human cost. The long damage that would follow these men for years. The marriages strained by long absence. The young men aged prematurely by hard labor and harsh conditions. The dreams deferred or abandoned entirely. One night, unable to sleep, he climbed to the ship's deck and found Master Sergeant Kowalski there, smoking his pipe and watching the stars. They stood in comfortable silence for a while before Kowalski spoke. "You know what mining teaches you?" he asked. "Patience. The mountain doesn't care about your schedule or your war or your homesickness. It yields its treasure slowly, reluctantly. You learn to work at the mountain's pace, not your own." He tapped his pipe against the rail, watching the sparks disappear into the dark ocean. "We'll go home, and people will ask what we did in the war. We'll say we were miners, and they'll nod without understanding. They'll think we were safe, far from danger. They won't understand that we fought the mountain every day, that every breath was a small battle against the dust, that every ton of ore cost us something we'll never get back." San Francisco appeared through the morning fog like a mirage, its bridges and buildings proof that civilization had continued in their absence. As the ship docked, a band played patriotic songs, and Red Cross volunteers distributed coffee and donuts. It was a hero's welcome for men who didn't consider themselves heroes. Thomas was discharged at the Presidio, his service complete. He had one final duty, delivering his written accounts and photographs to the Army Historical Division. The officer who received them, a major who had spent the war behind a desk, flipped through them with polite disinterest. "Mining operation, you say? In New Guinea? Well, I'm sure someone will find this useful someday. File it with the other support unit reports." Thomas wanted to explain that these weren't just reports, they were testimonies to sacrifice and endurance. But he could see it would be futile. The war would be remembered for its battles and generals, not for the men who dug aluminum ore from a mountain jungle. Before leaving California, Thomas organized one last gathering. Using his discharge pay, he rented a small theater in San Francisco and invited all the Camp Hollow Mountain veterans he could locate. About 40 men showed up, some already in civilian clothes, others still in uniform awaiting final processing. He had managed to obtain a copy of The Best Years of Our Lives, the film about veterans returning home that had resonated so strongly in the jungle. As he threaded the projector one last time for this group, he felt the weight of their shared experience. The film played to an audience that understood it in ways the filmmakers probably never intended. When Frederick March's character struggled to explain his war experience to civilians, heads nodded in recognition. When Harold Russell's character dealt with his disability, they thought of their own invisible wounds, the lung damage, the chronic back pain, the memories that would surface unbidden for years to come. After the film, they gathered in the theater's lobby. There were no speeches, no formal ceremony. Just men who had shared something extraordinary in an ordinary way, saying goodbye before dispersing to their separate futures. Thomas returned to Iowa, to the Rialto Theater that had waited for him. He married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 children, and spent 40 years showing films to his community. But he never forgot Camp Hollow Mountain. In his projection booth, he kept a piece of bauxite that Kowalski had given him, using it as a paperweight. Sometimes, during the quiet moments between real changes, he would hold it, feeling its rough texture, remembering the mountain that had given so much and taken so much in return. Years later, when his grandson asked him about his war service, Thomas struggled to explain. How could he convey the importance of what had seemed so mundane? How could he describe the heroism of simply enduring, day after day, in conditions that ground men down like the mountain ground down their tools? He settled for showing the boy a film, The Bridge on the River Kwai, about prisoners building a bridge for their captors. It wasn't exactly like that, he told his grandson, but the feeling was similar. We built something that mattered, even if the world never knew our names. The boy watched, entranced by the story on screen, not fully understanding that his grandfather had lived his own version of that story, one reel at a time, one ton of ore at a time, in a place where movies were medicine and mining was warfare conducted by other means. In his final years, Thomas compiled his notes and photographs into a memoir that was published by a small military history press. It sold few copies, but those who read it understood that they were reading about a different kind of courage, the courage to persist without glory, to sacrifice without recognition, to serve in the shadows while others stood in the spotlight. The Camp Hollow Mountain miners gradually passed away, their lungs finally succumbing to the damage inflicted decades earlier. But their legacy lived on in the aluminum that had become aircraft, in the films that had sustained spirits, in the small acts of heroism that define ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. The mountain itself still stands in Papua New Guinea, its mine entrances long since collapsed, the jungle reclaiming what was briefly carved from it. Local legends now include stories of the pale men who entered the mountain and emerged covered in gray dust, who brought moving pictures that danced on white cloth, who sang strange songs in the darkness. Sometimes, villagers say, on quiet nights when the rain has stopped and the jungle holds its breath, you can still hear sounds from the mountain, the distant echo of drilling, the rattle of cars on rails, and faintly, so faintly it might be imagination, the sound of men laughing at a joke told by a projected image, finding joy in the depths of hardship. The war ended, as wars do, with treaties and ceremonies and monuments to the fallen. But for the men of Camp Hollow Mountain, the war ended each night when the projector started, when the beam of light cut through darkness to create a world of possibility on a makeshift screen. In those moments, they were not miners or soldiers or exiles, they were simply men, watching stories unfold, dreaming of home, and surviving another day in their battle with the mountain. Thomas Hartley died peacefully in his sleep in 2005, at the age of 85. His obituary in the Burlington newspaper mentioned his service as a projectionist in the Pacific Theater but didn't specify where. His children found, among his effects, hundreds of pages of typed notes, carefully preserved photographs, and a worn piece of reddish-brown rock that seemed unremarkable except for the note attached to it. Bauxite ore from Camp Hollow Mountain, New Guinea, 1943 to 1944. Approximately 75,000 tons extracted. Estimated 2,000 aircraft produced. 300 men served. All gave some. Some gave all. Remember us.